in a G7 year especially, where Canada has the opportunity to set the tone amongst ordered nations, traditional allies. This is a moment for Canada to actually step out of the shadow and say, this organization matters, and this is why.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a show where we explore the structural connections that underpin our highly disordered world, and where we like to give credit to those nations who have tended historically to work on the side of order. From its important supportive role of the Allies in the world wars of the 20th century, to its key advocacy for the UN system, humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, and international treaties, Canada has always been a major player in the global ordering sweepstakes. It combines economy, a medium-sized population, a reasonably strong military force, with this idealistic and humanitarian zeal. So despite its seemingly peripheral geostrategic location, Canada is not a bit player in the global politics of democracies. In fact, Canada has unique advantages in the global system. No natural enemies, and the world's largest land border with a traditionally friendly nation. So what does Canada do when that largest land border no longer necessarily connects it to a trustworthy nation, and Canada's role of working with the US as a force multiplier for global order may no longer be feasible? Can Canada, in fact, step up to the plate and do what I've long advocated Keir Starmer to do, which is to present itself as an independent leader of the free world, something like a coordinator of other democracies? This would be quite challenging given the internal divisions inside Canada today and the unpopularity of its current leadership at present. So on Disorder, today we ask, what about Canada? I'm joined by Marci Surkes. She served as Executive Director of Policy and Cabinet Affairs in the office of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Previously, she had been Chief of Staff to former Minister Ralph Goodall. Surkes currently serves as Compass Rose's Public Policy and Communications Chief Strategy Officer. Welcome to Disorder, Marci.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Quite randomly, this is quite a timely moment for our conversation, as at the end of November, the sitting Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visited President-elect Trump in Mar-a-Lago, and this led to a headline-grabbing, eye-catching, ridiculous moment where Trump suggested that Canada was ripping off America to the tune of $100 billion a year, when in fact this is just Canada having a trade surplus with America, as many nations do. And then he made a bizarre meme about Canada needing to become the 51st state. Is this just some bizarre public joke and a meme, or does this actually have implications for the relationship of two core allies in the international system?
Yeah, look, the U.S.-Canada relationship is the most important allyship, clearly, that Canada has in the world, and the longest undefended land border in the entire world. It is a great success story of friendship and partnership, true partnership, over the course of the lifespan of these two countries. We are suddenly in a moment, and we have experienced this moment in the not-so-distant past, and yet, although we saw the original, the sequel is shaping up to be quite a different script, it feels. And so to your question, I would say right now, from the Canadian perspective, people are taking it quite seriously. Jokes are only funny when there's a nugget of truth to them. And so what is the nugget of truth in this joke? And how seriously do we have to take it? I would submit quite seriously. And I think it is being taken seriously, but massaged in the public discourse to ensure there isn't unnecessary panic.
I like how you've put that, because jokes, whether they're in a romantic context and the boss says, oh, I was just joking, I wasn't incorrectly flirting with my staff member, there's obviously an element of truth to the inappropriate joke. And in this case, people may not realize this mind-blowing statistic, which is that at present, the U.S. exports more to Canada than it does to France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK combined. And the U.S.-Canadian relationship is the largest bilateral trade relationship in the entire world. So if all of a sudden Trump says that there's going to be 25% tariffs when there's never been an ad valorem tariff like that, and people don't realize that many goods are produced by having some manufacturing process in Canada, coming to the US, having another process, going back to Canada, going back to the US. It's not like one good is produced and then shipped. That's the 19th century. We're in the 21st century, and seamless, frictionless trade has been at the core of the US-Canada relationship. Of course, potentially threatening that is very serious. What I want to ask you, though, Marci, is that Trump wants to maximize what's good for him and what he sees as good for US interests. Isn't it true that seamless, frictionless trade with Canada grows the US economy and is good for every major US multinational company? Why would you want to threaten that?
Well, I mean, that's precisely the irony of the situation in which we find ourselves. And you've taken the page right out of the playbook of the Canadian government and the Team Canada approach, which is going to be pointing out that, in fact, this is an integrated supply chain. In particular, I think of the example that's often cited, automotive manufacturing, where the parts move back and forth across that Canada-US border, sometimes more than 9 or 10 times before the vehicle is completed. It is that closely integrated. So the impact will be real and genuinely felt by Canadians and Americans on both sides of the border. So Canadians understand very well that the American people have made this choice with a clear and decisive election, and that Americans who, let's be honest, in spite of what we've just talked about and this tremendous relationship with $1 billion of trade flowing back and forth every day, in spite of the largesse of this relationship, Americans don't think that much about Canadians until they may feel the pinch. Americans, from a Canadian perspective, Americans do need to better understand what precisely it is we are talking about here.
Yes, the war between orderers and disorderers is frequently one of information, whereby the orderers try to explain why the thing is a win-win situation, and the disorderers try to cast it as zero-sum, i.e., that I can win while you lose. And now I have to believe, though, that some people benefit from that disorder, Marci. What structural interests would benefit from a 25% tariff between the US and Canada and severing this incredibly lucrative and remunerative relationship? Who would the winners be of this disorder?
Let's put it this way. In the immediate aftermath of a decision of this magnitude, I don't believe there would be winners on either side of the border in the immediate sense, because the impact on the average Canadian and American would be real and would be felt. If the ultimate goal is disruption, then this clearly does play into that narrative. This would disrupt that relationship. It would make it further complicated to continue to exist as we have, harmoniously side by side with integrated supply chains and economies. And it may very well be the case that the end goal desire of disruption is, in fact, to disrupt everything, even relationships that have been deep and lasting, to a point where they are no longer so. That is what the subtext of the meme of him looking across with a Canadian flag planted, that in fact Canada is not a peer nation, is not a G7 ally and partner, is the child at the table or at the children's table just adjacent to where everyone else is having dinner. And so the end goal is one of two things, either isolation from other nations, or it's an attempt to recast Canada as a submissive secondary partner.
Yes, I think you hit on so many key points there. The only winners would be the disorderers. In other words, Russia and China would be the winners from a disruption in US-Canadian trade. So this makes me wonder if Canada can present a counterpoint. Obviously, if we put aside the trade issue for a moment and we just look up the kind of global ordering sweepstakes, when Trump is saying, hey, we're not going to supply arms to Ukraine as much as we did before, and maybe we're not even going to pay attention to the Middle East in the way that we did before. Canada is a place where there's a very strong Ukrainian-Canadian community, and a place that has this great tradition of standing with NATO and with the UN. How could Canada see in this moment of tremendous danger a moment of opportunity to kind of step into its own as a convener and leader?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, every crisis does present opportunity. That is the reality. And And Canada could step forward, and I hope actually does take this opportunity to step forward as a global leader. We are entering 2025. Canada assumes the presidency of the G7, and as a country that has valued and deeply integrated into the G7 and all aspects of the G7. And what we do not know, given that we are also entering in 2025 an election year in Canada, and we'll have to touch on that, we don't know at this moment in time who will be the sitting prime minister at the moment of convening the G7 nations, just as we don't know at this moment who will be representing some of the other key allies. It could very well be that there will be new faces at the table from France. There certainly will be a new face from the United Kingdom. We don't know who will be welcomed from Germany at this moment. We know who will be representing the United States if he chooses to participate in that meeting of G7 nations. I would hope that he does. But even in Canada, we are in a minority parliament, and right now the Trudeau Liberals are not faring incredibly well. But just to say, in a G7 year especially, where Canada has the opportunity to set the tone amongst ordered nations, traditional allies, this is a moment for Canada to actually step out of the shadow and say, this organization matters, and this is why.
Dealing with President Trump is a challenge for even the most charismatic of leaders with a great economy and amazing institutions. But we've learned some things over time, which is that the president loves favors and flattery, and he doesn't mind when people engage in transactional relations with him. You know, I scratch your back if you scratch mine. But I was a little worried to see Prime Minister Trudeau go to Mar-a-Lago because that was a violation of the Logan Act. And for those who don't know, the Logan Act is one of the longest standing U.S. pieces of legislation. It dates back to 1799, and it prohibits private U.S. citizens from engaging in talks or negotiations with foreign governments without the permission of the sitting U.S. government. And it doesn't surprise me when Viktor Orban or Benjamin Netanyahu violate the Logan Act, but I was actually surprised to see Justin Trudeau doing it. And maybe he understands that this will give him more face time and better rapport with Trump. But what other things can he do? How would you counsel him about how to handle the intensely personalized nature of the relationship with Trump?
That's interesting. On the Logan Act, that's not been part of the discourse in Canada since the trip. I would say by and large, the feeling seems to be in Canada that it was the right move. It was an important move because Canadians fundamentally understand how transactional Trump is. In order to deal with someone who is that transactional, you have to transact. You have to be present. In terms of how to manage that relationship, again, this can be Trudeau's advantage. This can be what catapults him back into relevance from an electoral perspective. He has lived this relationship. It has not gone well at different times, and there have been other moments of great success. The negotiation of the renewed North American Free Trade Agreement, which Americans call the USMCA and Canadians call CUSMA, the Canadian-US Mexico Agreement, that is a great success. And it did not come overnight. It came because the relationship with Donald Trump was treated from the first instance as a constant campaign style relationship. And that is what we are seeing come back into play. There is leader to leader. There is advisors to advisors. And again, it's not always gone well. Trump left the last G7 Canada hosted in Charlevoix, Quebec. Trump left on kind of an unhappy note. He was grumpy, and Trump remembers that. That being said, Trudeau does not take for granted how he has to operate with Trump, and he will play the game. They are playing the game. It is what is going to be necessary to ensure that Canada does not get brushed aside. And it looks different, but this is Canada leaning into that relationship with Trump, whatever it takes.
Could you sketch a picture of what does Canadian politics look like right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Canadians pride ourselves and have for a very long time on the constitutional norm of peace, order, and good government. Canada is a very orderly nation. It is a nation of the rule of law. And that has been consistently so, regardless of who has been in power. At a federal level, only Liberals and Conservatives have ever formed government. And right now, we are in the 10th year of the Prime Minister's tenure and mandate. And even if you're not a close follower of Canadian politics, you may recall that it was quite a landslide victory in 2015, where Mr. Trudeau propelled the Liberal Party from third party opposite in the Commons into the leading position with a majority government. He has subsequently won two minority governments. Minority parliaments. We're into the second.
What is the coalition in Canada? What are its components?
So Trudeau has governed since 2021 with the assistance of a second party in the Commons, a sort of center-left, but actually further left party than the Liberal Party called the New Democratic Party. It's led by Jagmeet Singh. First, with an arrangement, a so-called supply and confidence agreement, which is essentially an arrangement between those parties to have an informal but formal coalition, a de facto coalition. For the past 2 years, they governed in relative stability. The New Democrats decided, watching the flagging polls of Mr. Trudeau at some point over this past summer, that they would come out in the fall and say that that arrangement no longer suited them. So we are into a traditional minority parliament situation, which means that the coalition that existed no longer does on paper. The Liberals need to find a dance partner to advance any government bills through the House of Commons. So not unlike in Congress, where you have to work across the aisle and make friends. In the minority parliament situation, you really have to have a lot of friends. However, the House of Commons, for the past 7 weeks, I believe it is now, has been tied up in a filibuster where the Conservative Party, which is the main opposition party to the Liberal government and the assumed government in waiting, headed by Pierre Poilievre, they have been actively filibustering all debates in the Commons, and the Commons has essentially ground to a halt. Mr. Poilievre, who is running a campaign style of opposing the government, has effectively chosen a disruption tactic to underscore his overarching narrative, which is that under Justin Trudeau, Canada is, quote, broken.
You've sketched that very clearly, and you've also given resonances for Americans in the way that Republicans have long said, look, Biden or Obama, he can't get anything done. The system is broken, without pointing out that, oh, the reason they can't get anything done is we're filibustering Obama's plans and we're making it impossible for them to make the health care actually work or to get to single payer or whatever. So that this neo-populist strategy of blocking and then saying, look, it's the opponents who can't get anything done is a little tongue-in-cheek, right? But is this having cut through with the Canadian electorate, or might this backfire against the Conservatives for having such a long filibuster?
I do think that Conservatives run the risk of overplaying their hand, and their hand right now is quite strong. I think Canadians are receptive to this message, not because the Commons isn't functioning per se. Commons is not necessarily the first matter most Canadians think about when they get up in the morning. But what is resonant is a real deep-seated feeling that has existed since the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, that Canadians feel there has been a steady erosion of their standard of living. In Canada, we have a long pattern of changing governments after about a decade, give or take. And this feeling of dissatisfaction, exacerbated by the polarization in our politics, for all of these reasons, Trudeau is bearing the brunt of this discontent, and the Conservative message is resonating.
It's a winter of discontent against all incumbents in democracies globally. 2 weeks ago, we had Ben Ansell on the pod, and we put in that great FT graph showing that since statistics have been kept, incumbents have done the worst in the 2024 elections than they've ever done, and that this sentiment of blaming whoever is in office for the fact that changes in the methods of production have meant that people feel worse standard of living is just a phenomenon everywhere. We're going to put links in the show notes to your appearance on Paul Wells, where there's a very interesting panel discussion that you starred in. And you said that the Canadian 2025 election will, in some aspects, be a referendum on what happened in the US in November 2024. Could you explain that more to us? How is it that Canadians in this 2025 domestic Canadian election will express their feelings about what has transpired in the US?
As I said off the top of the show, there is no more important relationship to Canada than the United States. So from a Canadian perspective, there has been no greater event, in spite of the fact that, all the things I just rattled off in terms of the parliament not working and this discourse in the Canadian public discussion around how Canadians are living or not living better than our parents, the inability to afford housing, which has become a real issue. Immigration has become a real issue as a corollary issue to lack of housing. In spite of all of these real issues that are Canadian at heart, it is the US election that shapes how we feel, how we fare, how we live, because of how integrated we are as North American partners and neighbors. And so my prediction is that if there is ever a quote unquote ballot box question, which there isn't always, but if there is going to be one in 2025, there is no question in my mind that Canadians will have the US implications on their mind, because it will either be that tariffs have been placed on Canadian goods and that is wreaking havoc on the economy, or it will be that Mr. Trudeau has managed to dissuade Donald Trump from taking that position, in which case Trudeau may have another chance at life in government. Or it will be that the tariffs come in at some level and Trudeau is blamed for mismanaging the relationship and will be voted out entirely. And as it stands right now in the polls, it looks like it will be a strong, solid victory for the Conservatives. But it all hinges on how the next few months play out in this Canada-US relationship. It is that singularly important to Canada.
That's a very compelling narrative, Marci. Intrinsically, as an outsider, I agree with you that it will be on that US-Canadian relationship that there will be a kind of referendum via the Canadian election. We just can't say exactly how it will play out and what the referendum question will be. So one of the mistakes that the Democrats did in 2024 is they were very clear that we were going to have a referendum on, do you want to have Trump back or not? And are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? But they didn't put forth necessarily the right person and the right campaign with the right choreography to wage that single question referendum against Trump. And I would wonder if it might not be wise for the Liberals to replace Trudeau going into that single issue referendum, because he's been mired in scandals going all the way back to the SNC-Lavalin scandal and the issues with Libyan money and many other issues. Wouldn't it be best to wage this vision for the Liberals and the center-left in Canada with another figurehead?
Well, so look, I think that actually if you take the American example, the very recent example of that late in the game switch of the leading horse from the president to the vice president, there was a period of time, particularly in those initial days, when the Democrats seemed to have all of the momentum going into that convention. And it seemed at that moment that that was precisely what the Liberals should do. I think we know what happened on that first Tuesday of November, and that was that switching horses late in the race was not the key to success.
I don't think that was the issue, is that they switched to the wrong horse.
Well, that's entirely possible. But look, what the Liberals would have to, if the Liberal Party were to change leaders at this stage, and there is not a clear process for this to happen, there is no means by which the caucus can push the leader out. The leader would have to take the decision to move or be convinced to. If the leader, Mr. Trudeau, were to take the decision not to lead the party into the next election, the party has a very limited time frame in which to operate now to bring forward some other potential successor. We don't run primaries like you do in the US, but even if you were to run a fair contest for a leader, All of that takes a good number of months to engage party membership and supporters from coast to coast to coast, and time is running out. We're into an election either this spring or in the fall. So to that question of can you just switch and find someone else and get in, there is no obvious successor in the case of the Liberal Party of Canada. It would be a true leadership race, and it is not necessarily better for the party, in spite of the fact that the party's agenda actually does not seem to be what's at issue as much as its leadership. In some respects, I think that anyone in that position of leadership actually has to look and say, what is the most responsible choice at this juncture for my party? And the most responsible choice at this juncture for the Liberal Party may very well be to have Justin Trudeau complete this mandate and see where the election goes, and then rebuild with a true leadership race following an election.
Okay, that's a compelling way of looking at it, but I'd like to disaggregate two things that you mentioned there. The question of switching to the wrong horse, and then the question of switching horses. I understand from what you've said that the Canadian system is more akin to the American one, where Biden had to step down. But we've heard about Mélanie Joly, the Canadian foreign minister, and the ongoing crisis with India over these last months, the murder of Canadian citizens, the issues of those who support a separate Sikh state, and that she, Mélanie Joly, has been being built up as a potential successor in the Liberal Party. Tell us more about her and about the Canadian relationship with India and how that might be playing out in the upcoming Canadian election.
So very quickly to finish the last question, there is no one obvious successor. There are a number of high-profile ministers in the Liberal cabinet that could all be successors. Madame Joly is one of, but there are a number of others, and there are people who are external to government right now who are Liberals who may come into the race, quite notably the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who has been rumored for some time to be taking an active interest in politics, and it would be the Liberal Party would be his natural party. Madame Joly, for those who don't follow closely, there was quite a significant profile on her in the New York Times just the other day. She is one of the profile ministers.
Which we will have a link to in the show notes.
Which she is one of the profile ministers in cabinet. And I will say one thing first about domestic politics. Canadians, in terms of how they elect and are going to elect the next government, are going to be thinking about Canada-US, but that's probably mostly it from a geopolitical perspective. Madame Joly would, like all of the others competing for that leadership position, actually have to go back to what we were talking about in terms of Harris and the economy, and actually speaking to that feeling of malaise, that feeling of not being able to keep up, that Canadians are clearly feeling. It is an affordability crisis point. And that is the message that the Liberals actually need to get back to, bread and butter issues like that, in order to have a chance at electoral success, regardless of who's the leader. With respect to Canada and India, I would say that in spite of how serious it is, Canada had sort of pivoted from China in an Indo-Pacific strategy that Madame Joly actually ushered in, India being the Indo in the Indo-Pacific. Part of that strategy heralded as being the next best partner for Canada in the region. To suddenly have this diplomatic row between these two countries has been highly inconvenient for Canadian foreign policy. It has real and material impacts on the economy, but it has not penetrated the Canadian psyche or electorate to the extent you might think it would, given the importance of India in the rising global economies. I think in spite of some of the favorable press internationally, there is some domestic views that her approach to global affairs, which is very traditionally Canadian and some of what we've mentioned, model of multinationalism, perhaps has been not meeting the moment of disorder in the world.
I think you sketched that really clearly. Throughout major Western democracies, foreign policy is now seen. How does it affect my core bread and butter issues? Inflation, cost of living, and immigration.
That's the case with the one massive exception in the Canadian experience, which will be the relationship with the United States, which, pardon the pun, trumps everything else for Canada from a geopolitical perspective.
After the break, Marci and I talk about a budding bromance, the UK-Canada relationship. Let's talk about the UK-Canada relationship. Obviously, Canada used to be a dominion of the United Kingdom. Canada is one of the most important countries in the Commonwealth. It has the second largest economy in the Commonwealth. Tell us, what is the state of this UK-Canada relationship? And with Trudeau and Keir Starmer being from relatively similar political traditions, is there a way that that relationship could be made stronger and be a pole for order globally?
Well, I think you've probably put your finger on what relationship this government intends to showcase at the G7 meetings. There should be a natural closeness between these two leaders, between their parties, as you say, cut from similar traditions and cloths in terms of perspective. And I'm actually surprised that we haven't seen more of a Starmer-Trudeau bromance thus far. I would say on that one, stay tuned for 2025. I suspect we will see more of that. Closer integration again as Canada takes hold of this presidency. It's going to hold the reliable friends very, very close. And Canada and the UK share such a deep affinity, as you say, that this is the time, if that relationship with Starmer hasn't warmed up yet, to really get on it.
I love it. I want to see this Starmer-Trudeau bromance more than most straight men would want to see it. I just want to confess it. So, Marci, help me order the disorder. How can Canada play the role of a medium power in this ordering sweepstakes? Many people may not realize how important Canada has been at making UN peacekeeping missions, calming down tensions, for example, over the Suez Crisis in 1956, playing a key role in as different conflicts as the first Gulf War and in Afghanistan, and really being at the top table where issues of peace and security and trade and coordination are waged. So what would be one suggestion you would have to Canadian leaders as they face this moment of disorder but potential opportunity?
Canada right now, under the Liberal Party, has to take a decision. And that decision is, if the Liberal Party is to be successful domestically and on the global stage, does this paradigm fit the moment? Because it is starting to feel like it does not. And that is going to take nothing short of a real shift and vision internally at the very tippy top of the government to grab hold of this opportunity to lead the G7 and say, the agenda of this meeting at this moment is the opportunity for Canada to demonstrate to the world's most powerful nations that we can play beyond our medium size, that we, in fact, can be not only the conveners, but like convening feels almost like a lack of action at this time. It is like convening plus. It is convening, coordinating, and pushing the G7 to stay together and stay strong, because the BRICS are getting stronger and stronger. And if this alliance is to remain the most important and powerful in the world, it is going to take a lot of deliberate planning right now. The G7 collectively has to double down on its support for NATO. It has to double down on its support for itself, quite frankly. And the opportunity for Canada to push that organization forward is right now. If there was a moment for Canada to emerge a little bit from the shadows to say, hey guys, not only are we here, you need someone to lead this parade, and we're going to lead it, and we're going to bring you together and ensure that we are not only talking but doing.
Allow me to say, from your mouth to God's ears.
Yes.
I sometimes think it's useful for medium powers to have one signature policy, Marci.
Yes.
For example, when Boris Johnson was doing some convening, he was going to say something about net zero and 2030 and 2050, and they didn't follow through. But if, for example, they had a key policy, say, about windmills, and, Britain is a very important medium power, but if they had this policy and said, look, we spent these $10 billion on these windmills, you guys can do it also, I think that that's really effective. While we're trying to order the disorder, what's one key achievable policy that you would like to see the Canadian leadership implement domestically and then push for other G7 countries to adopt?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this has been probably the biggest challenge for Liberals, period. Certainly the Liberal Party that I've been part of has been an inability to prioritize. You can even just take a look at the platforms that the Liberal Party runs on. There tend to be many, many commitments and promises. But one thing that this government proved it was able to do in a moment of crisis, at a time of great crisis, unprecedented crisis in the COVID pandemic, was to singularly focus on a response. And I believe this government needs to harness that energy, and they actually need to say to the G7, here are the one or two things we are going to do together. And I think for right now, if Canada, and Canada is going to have a challenge doing this because it is not perceived to be the strongest player at the table with respect to defense and security, but I actually believe that that needs to be at the top of the agenda. And Canada needs to say, we are going to do our share, and it is going to be difficult to get there, but we are going to. If we are going to, we expect all of you to, and let's come out of this together collectively and say, we are all in on security spending and security commitments, and that it is a defense and security posture that is tough and tight and coordinated, and that it prioritizes as much spending on hard defense issues as it does on so-called softer defense issues, strengthening countries that need help, strengthening partnerships around the world in order to elevate the security posture, period.
I think that we orderers need to hope for the best but plan for the worst, Marci. And you've had a lot of very top-level experience, like in the Prime Minister's office. So imagine a scenario, it's mid-2025, and Trump has gotten through some of his worst cabinet picks and then has actually implemented some of his batshit crazy policies. And there are 25% tariffs on goods, and he has sold the Ukrainians down the river and, let's say, started a hot war with Iran. What would be your advice to ordering powers like Canada, the UK, Germany, France? If the world seems to be veering off course, what would you suggest they do?
So the urgency is real to ensure that within the G7, that the bilateral relationships that Canada enjoys are all as strong as they can and need to be. And I would say in particular, the Canadian-UK relationship right now, there is a need to get the economic conversation back on track. There is benefit to both countries to be able to position, to diversify their holdings as you would diversify your own holdings if you're an investor. Nations, great nation states need to diversify where they are doing business and how. And whatever roadblocks there have been between Canada and the United Kingdom in terms of reaching a current arrangement on free trade, this would be the time to try to order that house. This is the time to ensure that that bilateral relationship across the board is as strong as it needs to be. Again, perhaps with Canada pushing forward the G7, but working with each of these nations individually to ensure that they are exactly where they need to be in the event or the possibility that the United States may no longer play the central role that we have all come to rely on it to play in terms of being the orderer, the world's security, the world's police force, however you want to put it. And those monikers are sometimes viewed through positive lens and sometimes through less than positive lens, but that is the reality of the post-war period until today. We have all relied on the United States disproportionately, and we do need to be ready for that to change. And in order to be ready to prepare, my best advice is, as I said, do not take any relationship for granted. Strengthen them right now.
Now, I want to ask you, if you were queen for a day of the entire global system, and you could make one international institution, not one we already have, like the G7 or NATO or the UN, one new institution to deal with any challenge. It could be climate change, it could be tax havens, it could be AI regulation. What would this institution be, and how would it operate?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say that what I would like to see more of, and perhaps this is unsurprising coming from somebody who advised Mr. Trudeau, and as I said, in terms of a legacy on the international stage, the prioritization of gender equality, I actually don't believe that any of our international instruments right now or institutions actually properly handle the continued lack of equality between women and men across the globe. And I'm not sure that there is a superstructure on top of anything existing that would work. But if I were queen for a day and there was the opportunity to recognize countries that recognize that equality between the sexes is long overdue and could push together to ensure that women and girls are supported from the earliest instances of life all the way through to reach their leadership potential, economic potential. If we had more women leaders, I actually believe quite fervently that we would not be in the state of disorder that we find ourselves in today.
I fervently believe in what Marci has just said. It's not just a question of feminism for feminism's sake. If we look at the few female world leaders that there have been in major Western countries, whether it's Thatcher or Merkel or Golda Meir, we think of leaders who've been actually quite successful. And then you look at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand and you realize, it doesn't hurt a country's standing to, once every other decade have a female leader. In fact, it may really help it. So if we could be nurturing talent, there must be talent that is untapped here, right, Marci?
There is talent that is untapped, and the political sphere has become so unappealing to strong women. The amount of vitriol, the visceral hate that gets propagated and directed disproportionately at women, and I think this cuts across every partisan line, it cuts across every one of our great nations. Women are being actively discouraged from stepping up and standing up, and that is to our collective detriment.
I hope Marci and I have convinced you that Canada is not a bit player in the global ordering sweepstakes. Just as Iran can be a small economy, but a major disorderer, Canada is a medium-sized economy, but it is a major orderer because of its trading relationships, its cultural capital, its deep investment in international institutions. So as Marci and I have talked about the hosting of this G7, Canada really can push forward certain key issues, be they gender equality, be they the UK-Canada relationship, be they the need for free trade. Like, I'd love to see Trudeau use the G7 to make the case for free trade for everyone. There are so many opportunities here. As always, the Auditor-in-Chief has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. In the Substack this week, we are going to highlight some other appearances that Marci has done about internal Canadian politics and how Canadians view Trump 2.0. Please join the Substack. I think you'll enjoy those. So whether or not wherever you live, you're having a white Christmas, I hope you dream of the Canadian Rockies and of an orderly white Christmas with moose and Royal Canadian Mounties coming and ordering all of the affairs.